It was a day like no other, a day that would leave a lasting imprint on their lives, forever altering the course of their destinies. Jonathan Mitchell, a successful architect, stood at the precipice of his own unraveling, drowning in the complexities of his personal life. Yet amidst the chaos, there was a small bright beacon of light that refused to flicker out, his 7-year-old daughter Joyce. It had been another sleepless night. The weight of betrayal, business failures, and heartache. Too much for one man to bear. Jonathan, despite his wealth and influence, had built an empire on shattered pieces of his past, pieces he was too afraid to confront. As the sun began to rise over the skyline of New York City, casting golden beams over the glass buildings, Jonathan lay there in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet the storm raging inside him. The memory of his ex-wife Tiffany, her departure still fresh in his mind, gnawed at him like an open wound. She had left him for Albert, a man he had once trusted as a business partner, a friend. The betrayal had come swiftly, leaving Jonathan blindsided and heartbroken. And then there was his daughter Joyce, caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand. Tiffany, the woman who was supposed to be her mother, had chosen another man over her family, leaving Joyce to grow up in the shadow of her father's pain. But Jonathan's life wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about the broken marriage, or the crooked business partner who had stolen everything from him. It was about moving forward, about giving Joyce a better future, a future she deserved. Still, no matter how many deals he closed, how many projects he completed, there was an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing her, the little girl who had become his entire world. The sound of footsteps on the stairs brought Jonathan back to reality. It was Joyce. She had been awake for hours, bouncing with energy as only children could. But today, there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the usual routine. School, work, the monotony of it all. No, today was different. "Dad, wake up, it's time." Joyce's voice echoed through the quiet room, her bright eyes gleaming with excitement. She stood at the edge of the bed, tugging at his sleeve. "We can't be late for school, and I don't want cereal today, okay? I want toast with jam. And no office today, please. It's boring." Jonathan smiled softly, trying to fight the exhaustion that was threatening to take over. He could feel the weight of the day ahead, the meetings, the phone calls, the responsibilities. But for a moment, none of that mattered. It was just him and Joyce, and for once, that was enough. "I've made you toast," Jonathan said gently, sitting up in bed, his heart swelling with love for the little girl who had become his reason to keep going. "And after school, Haley will pick you up. You know you're too young to be alone, right? But I promise, no office today. Let's make today special." Joyce's face lit up with a smile so bright it could have illuminated the whole room. She ran to the door and stopped, turning back to Jonathan. "Dad, I love you." "I love you too, Angel," Jonathan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And so they started their day together, the city outside buzzing with activity as the morning unfolded like any other. But Jonathan knew, deep down, that today was going to be different. There was a change in the air, a shift in the universe that he couldn't quite explain, but that he could feel deep in his bones. After taking Joyce to school, Jonathan headed to his office. His firm had become one of the most prestigious in the city, but it had come at a cost. The long hours, the endless projects, the stress, it all weighed on him like an anchor. He had no time for himself, and worse, no time for Joyce. The divorce from Tiffany had broken him, and he had thrown himself into his work to numb the pain. But that numbness, that distance, had slowly started to create a gap between him and his daughter. He saw it in her eyes, the way she clung to him a little longer at bedtime, the way she asked more questions about her mother. Tiffany had always been distant, but now it seemed like she had disappeared entirely from their lives. Joyce missed her, of course. But Jonathan, he was growing tired of the lies and the betrayal. He had tried to be a good father, to give Joyce everything she needed, but he couldn't help but feel like it was never enough. It was never enough for Tiffany, and now sometimes it felt like it wasn't enough for Joyce either. As the day dragged on, Jonathan found himself distracted. He kept checking his phone for messages from his daughter or his secretary Haley. Nothing. It wasn't until later that afternoon that something truly unexpected happened. Jonathan had been in a meeting when he received a call from Haley. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, and that unsettled Jonathan. "Jonathan, there's someone here to see you," she said. "She says she's waiting for you in your office." Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't expecting anyone. Not today. Not after everything that had happened. He was about to hang up when he heard Haley's voice again, this time laced with confusion. She says she's your date? For the wedding. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. The wedding. Tiffany and Albert's wedding. For a brief, insane moment, Jonathan thought about the possibility of going there alone. But the thought was fleeting. He had a business meeting with a potential client that could change everything, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time on his past. Not when he had worked so hard to build a future for Joyce. But that didn't explain the strange request. A date. A woman who claimed to be his. The idea was absurd. Haley's next words echoed in Jonathan's ears as he stood frozen in place. She's not what you might expect. Before Jonathan could process the words, he walked into his office, his eyes scanning the room. There, standing by the window, was a woman he had never seen before. Her clothes were tattered, her hair unkempt, but her eyes, they were full of life, full of hope. She was different. She was unlike anyone Jonathan had ever known. And yet, in that moment, she seemed to embody everything he had been missing. The warmth, the humanity, the connection he had been longing for. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to help. I'll go with you. Just for today. To the wedding. To show them who you really are." It took Jonathan a moment to gather his thoughts. His gaze shifted to her, then to the door, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring inside of him. Something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. This woman, this stranger, was offering him something that no one else had. An opportunity. A chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him piece by piece. Without saying another word, Jonathan nodded. This was a moment of reckoning. A moment to face his past and step into a future that he could no longer deny. And so as the doors of his office closed behind him, Jonathan felt the weight of the world shift. Today would be different. Today he would walk into that wedding hand in hand with someone who believed in him. Hand in hand with a woman who had nothing to lose, but everything to give. And for once, maybe that was enough. Jonathan stood in front of the mirror, his hand poised to adjust his tie, but his mind was elsewhere. He had just received a call from Haley, his trusted secretary, that left him with a whirlwind of emotions he wasn't prepared for. Tiffany's wedding, a moment he had been dreading, was fast approaching, but it was the unexpected twist in his reality that now consumed him. A woman, a beggar no less, was waiting in his office. She had somehow managed to convince Haley to let her in, claiming that she was to be Jonathan's date for Tiffany's wedding. The absurdity of it all hit him like a cold slap to the face. He was used to orchestrating his life, his business, his daughter's future with precision. Yet this was completely out of his control. It was as if the universe was testing him once again. A part of him was irritated by the inconvenience. Another part was intrigued by this strange encounter. Who was she? What did she want? And why had she shown up, of all places, in his office? His sacred workspace where everything was supposed to be orderly and predictable? His eyes flickered back to his reflection, studying the man he had become. A successful architect with a portfolio that spanned cities, yet hollow inside. The weight of years of heartbreak, betrayal, and financial ruin had taken a toll. He had been left broken by the woman he had once loved, the woman who had betrayed him with his business partner, and worse, left Joyce behind, the only light in Jonathan's life, as if she were a mere afterthought. Tiffany's absence was a constant reminder of the fragility of love, of how easily it could slip through your fingers when you least expected it. Jonathan had fought hard to rebuild his life, to provide Joyce with everything he had never had, a future filled with opportunities. But in his quest to create a better life for his daughter, he had unknowingly built a wall between them, consumed by work, driven by guilt, and haunted by the ghosts of his past. The phone call had been brief, almost perfunctory. Haley's voice, usually calm and collected, had held a hint of confusion. "She's waiting for you, Jonathan. She says she's your date just for today. I don't know what to make of it." A beggar? His mind raced. Who would show up out of nowhere claiming to be his date? And why? Was this some kind of joke? He couldn't understand why someone would put him in such a position. But then again, his life had been nothing but a series of shocks and surprises. Betrayal by Tiffany, sabotage by his former business partner Albert, a failed marriage. All of it had shattered him. He had spent so many years trying to fix what was broken, only to realize that sometimes fixing things meant accepting them for what they were. With a deep breath, Jonathan walked toward the office door. He had no choice but to face whatever this situation was. He pushed it open, and there she was, standing in the middle of his office. She wasn't what he had imagined. She wasn't glamorous, polished, or even the least bit interested in impressing anyone. In fact, she looked out of place in the sleek modern setting of Jonathan's firm. She was dressed in worn clothes, her hair untidy, and her face tired from a life he could only begin to imagine. She looked up as he entered, her eyes locking with his. They were a deep brown, full of vulnerability and something else. Something he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was fear. But whatever it was, it struck Jonathan in a way he wasn't prepared for. "You're Jonathan, right?" Her voice was soft, almost shy, but there was a strength to it, a sense of purpose that contrasted sharply with her appearance. "Yes," Jonathan replied, his voice betraying a hint of his confusion. "And you're my date?" She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "For today. I heard you needed someone to help you with your ex-wife's wedding. I thought maybe I could help." Jonathan stared at her, speechless for a moment. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. He hadn't expected anything like this. He had been dreading this day, facing Tiffany and Albert, the two people who had broken his heart. And now here was this woman, offering him a chance to navigate it with someone by his side. Someone who had nothing to do with his past and everything to do with the future he was still trying to figure out. He took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. This was all happening too quickly, too strangely. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about this moment. He had spent so much time running from his past, from his failures, that maybe he had missed something. Maybe this woman, this stranger, was here to help him face it. "Why?" Jonathan asked, his voice raw with curiosity. "Why would you help? Me?" She tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Because sometimes people need to see things from a different perspective. You've been through a lot, I can tell. And maybe I can help you, even if just for today. I'm not here to fix you, Jonathan, but I can be by your side. I can help you show Tiffany and Albert that you're not the man they left behind. You're someone more than that." Jonathan's chest tightened at her words. She spoke with such certainty, such kindness, that for a brief moment he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about the wedding or about Tiffany and Albert. Maybe it was about Jonathan finding his own strength again. Maybe he had been waiting for someone to remind him of that, even if it was a stranger, a homeless woman who had no reason to care about his world. "I don't even know your name," Jonathan said softly. "Laura," she replied, her gaze softening. "My name is Laura." It was strange, this sudden connection. Jonathan had been so closed off, so wrapped up in his own pain, that he hadn't realized how much he needed something like this. Something simple, someone real. Not someone trying to take from him or manipulate him, but someone who saw him for who he was. The man beneath the title, beneath the suit, beneath the broken pieces of his past. "I'm not sure how this is going to work," Jonathan said slowly, his mind racing. "But thank you, Laura. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Laura replied gently. "Just let me help." Jonathan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then he realized that this was the first time in a long while that he had felt seen. It wasn't the grand gestures that mattered. It was the small human connections that had the power to heal. "All right," he said, finally allowing himself a small smile. "Let's go." And just like that, they walked out of the office together. Jonathan had no idea where this strange, unexpected journey would take him. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of possibility. As they left the building, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder what had brought Laura into his life. He had spent so long focused on what he had lost, on the heartbreak that had defined him. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to start focusing on what he could gain. He wasn't sure if this was the beginning of something new or just another detour on his road to healing, but he couldn't ignore the sense of peace that washed over him as he looked at Laura walking beside him. It was the start of something different, something unexpected. And perhaps that was exactly what he needed. Jonathan's thoughts were swirling, the unexpected turn of events with Laura pulling him into a whirlpool of emotions. He walked alongside her, trying to ignore the echo of Tiffany's wedding invitation that had arrived in his inbox just a few hours ago. His ex-wife's upcoming nuptials to Albert, the man who had once been his trusted business partner. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the painful past and the unresolved tension he had yet to confront. But then there was Laura, a woman whose very presence seemed to disrupt the painful routine of his life, offering something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. She had no ties to his past, no baggage filled with broken promises and deceit. She was simply herself. And though Jonathan wasn't sure how or why she had stepped into his life at this very moment, he couldn't deny that her unexpected companionship was beginning to have an effect on him. The truth was, Jonathan had been running on autopilot for so long. Since his divorce from Tiffany, he had buried himself in work, determined not to let the pain consume him. The failure of his marriage had shattered him, left him questioning everything. Every success at the firm had felt hollow, every award for his architectural designs just a reminder of what he had lost. He had tried so hard to be the perfect father for Joyce, but he hadn't realized how much of himself he had sacrificed in the process. But now, with Laura at his side, something was beginning to shift. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about her calm presence, her willingness to stand by him without question, that was starting to break through his walls. As they approached the grand ballroom where Tiffany's wedding was taking place, Jonathan's chest tightened. It was hard to ignore the knot that formed in his stomach. His mind kept replaying moments from his past, his life with Tiffany, their shared dreams, and how easily everything had unraveled. He had loved her deeply, believed in their future together, and yet she had chosen Albert. She had chosen a man who had been his friend, his partner, and together they had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He could still remember the devastation he felt when Tiffany had packed her bags and left, a brief note in her place. He had been left with nothing but confusion and heartbreak, struggling to understand how the woman he had once called his soulmate could walk away without a second thought. But now, standing beside Laura, Jonathan found himself questioning everything. What had he truly lost in the end? Was it really Tiffany? Or was it the idea of what they could have been? Was it possible that, in his attempts to fix his broken heart, he had lost sight of the very thing that had always mattered most, the love of his daughter Joyce? "Are you all right?" Laura's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and reassuring, her hand lightly touching his arm as they walked. Jonathan blinked, startled by the question. For a moment he had forgotten she was there beside him, so consumed had he been by the weight of his own reflections. He looked at her, her gentle eyes filled with something he hadn't realized he was longing for: compassion. There was no judgment in her gaze, no expectation of anything from him except honesty. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt the pressure of his thoughts ease. "I'm fine," he said, offering her a tight smile. "Just thinking." "About the wedding?" she asked, her voice gentle, knowing that the day ahead wasn't going to be easy for him. He nodded, the words catching in his throat. "Yeah, it's hard to face. I never thought I'd be here, walking into this circus of a celebration with a stranger at my side. It's all just too surreal." Laura gave a soft laugh, her smile warm. "I'm not a stranger, Jonathan. I'm just someone who sees you, the real you. You've been through so much already. And I think this wedding, well, it's just another chapter, another reminder that the past doesn't define you. You're more than that." Jonathan stopped in his tracks for a moment, her words hanging in the air between them. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear those words. For years he had carried the weight of his failures on his shoulders, trying to fix everything, and everyone around him. But in all of that, he had forgotten to take care of himself. He had allowed Tiffany's betrayal to define him, to make him feel less than. But here was Laura standing with him, telling him that he was worth more than the mistakes of his past. "I don't even know what to say," Jonathan admitted, his voice rough. "It feels like everything is falling apart again, but I don't know if I have the strength to fight it anymore. I've been so focused on building things, my career, my life with Joyce, but I never stopped to ask myself if it was enough. If I'm enough." Laura looked at him, her expression soft and understanding. "You are enough, more than enough. I know it's hard to see right now, especially with everything going on, but you're strong, Jonathan. You've already shown that. And even though this wedding is going to be hard, it's just one moment. Don't let it take more from you than it needs to." Her words were like a balm to his weary soul. For a moment, Jonathan just stood there, letting the sound of her voice wash over him. He had spent so many years pushing people away, focusing only on what he could control. But in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it all alone. Maybe he could let someone in. Someone who understood what it meant to be broken and still have the strength to heal. Jonathan exhaled slowly, turning to look at Laura, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I'm not sure what I would have done without you here today." Laura smiled, the warmth in her eyes more than just kindness. It was something deeper, something that Jonathan hadn't realized he'd been craving. "I'm happy to be here," she said, her voice steady and calm. "And I'll be here for whatever comes next." As they continued walking toward the wedding venue, Jonathan's thoughts began to clear. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty. It was all still there, but somehow it didn't feel as heavy. He realized that maybe he didn't have to face the past alone. Maybe the future wasn't just about work or rebuilding a broken career. Maybe it was about finding balance, about learning to live again, not just for Joyce, but for himself. The wedding was still ahead, and Jonathan knew that it wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had someone who understood him, someone who was willing to walk beside him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And that was something he hadn't realized he needed until now. As they approached the entrance to the wedding venue, Jonathan's heart began to race again. But this time, it wasn't fear that made it beat faster. It was anticipation. With Laura by his side, maybe, just maybe, he could face the past without it controlling him. Maybe he could finally leave behind the heartbreak and betrayal and begin a new chapter. One that didn't have to be defined by his failures, but by his strength to rise again. Jonathan and Laura entered the venue together, hand in hand. The world outside still spun with its chaos, but inside, Jonathan felt like he was walking into a new beginning. One that was all his own. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking alone. Jonathan's mind was a maze of conflicting emotions as he stood outside Tiffany's wedding venue, the glimmering lights of the luxurious building reflecting the weight of his thoughts. Laura was by his side, her presence grounding him, a stark contrast to the swirling chaos of his past. The moments that had led up to this day felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage with no script, no clear role. But there was one thing he was sure of. He didn't want to go back. Not to the broken marriage with Tiffany, not to the emptiness that had consumed him for so long. And most importantly, he didn't want to return to the life that had made him forget how to truly live. As Jonathan's gaze shifted to the ornate doors ahead of him, he couldn't shake the memory of the day Tiffany had left. The sting of betrayal had been sharp and unrelenting. How could she have left him, not only for another man, but for the very person who had once been his closest confidant? Albert, his former business partner, had stolen not just Tiffany's heart, but also the trust Jonathan had placed in him. Alas, the years that followed, Jonathan had numbed himself with work, building his architectural firm, creating designs that had changed the city's skyline. But it was all hollow. None of it mattered when the one person who was supposed to stand by him had walked away. Tiffany's sudden departure had left a void in Jonathan's life that he hadn't even realized was there until now. He had been so focused on protecting his daughter Joyce, on making sure she never felt abandoned, that he hadn't given himself the chance to grieve. The pain of losing his wife, the woman he had loved and trusted, had been suffocating, but he had carried on, pretending everything was fine for the sake of his daughter. But as he stood next to Laura now, something was shifting inside him. The walls he had built around his heart were slowly crumbling piece by piece. She had come into his life like a breath of fresh air, filling the spaces that had once felt empty and desolate. Jonathan had never anticipated this, never thought that a chance encounter with a woman like Laura could lead him to rediscover a part of himself he had long buried. Laura wasn't just a stranger. She had become a silent strength in his life. She didn't ask for anything in return. She didn't judge him for his past mistakes or the choices he had made. She was simply there, offering a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. She was no longer just an assistant in his firm. She had become a companion, a confidant, someone who understood the fragility of life and the importance of moving forward. And yet, here they were, standing on the precipice of Jonathan's past, about to confront a painful chapter he thought he had closed. Tiffany's wedding wasn't just a celebration of her new life. It was a reminder of everything he had lost, everything that had slipped through his fingers. The thought of walking into that room to face Tiffany and Albert was enough to make Jonathan want to turn and run. He glanced at Laura, unsure of how to even begin processing what was to come, but her presence reassured him. She didn't say anything, but there was something in her eyes, a silent promise that whatever happened in that room, he wouldn't have to face it alone. "Are you sure about this?" Jonathan asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "This whole thing, it's not going to be easy. It's not just about the wedding. It's about facing everything I've tried to leave behind. The anger, the resentment, the guilt. I don't know if I can do it." Laura turned to him, her expression unwavering. "You've already done more than you think. You've survived this, Jonathan. You've rebuilt your life and your business. Now you're here doing what's right for your daughter. You're doing it for her and for you, and that's all that matters." Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about moving past the past, about confronting the very people who had hurt him, and finding the strength to let go of the anger that had been poisoning him for so long. As they entered the grand ballroom, Jonathan couldn't help but notice the glances that followed them, the whispers that fluttered in the air like a murmur of judgment. He had expected as much. After all, how could anyone understand why he would bring someone like Laura, a woman who had once been homeless, to such an event? The people in this room were the epitome of society's elite, wealthy, powerful, and accustomed to seeing only the polished and the perfect. Laura was neither of those things, but in that moment she felt like everything Jonathan needed. She was real, unpretentious, and kind, qualities that had long been absent in his life. They made their way through the crowd, Jonathan's hand gently resting on the small of Laura's back, guiding her through the sea of faces that watched them with curiosity and in some cases disdain. But Jonathan didn't care. He was here to make a statement, not to Tiffany, not to Albert, but to himself. He was no longer defined by the past. He was no longer the man who had been discarded and betrayed. He was Jonathan, a man who had risen from the ashes and built something new, something worth fighting for. As he approached Tiffany, a strange sense of calm washed over him. She was standing with Albert, their smiles too bright, their eyes too cold. Tiffany's gaze landed on Jonathan, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The world around them faded into the background as Jonathan met her eyes. It wasn't hatred that filled him, not anymore. It was pity. Pity for the woman who had once been the love of his life, who had so easily tossed it all away for something she thought would make her happy. "Jonathan," Tiffany said, her voice cool and controlled. "You made it." He offered a polite smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "I had to see it for myself." Tiffany's gaze flicked to Laura, an unreadable expression crossing her face. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice dripping, with a subtle challenge. "This," Jonathan said, his voice steady, "is Laura, my fiancée." The words hung in the air, the shock clear on Tiffany's face. She had expected Jonathan to be alone, to show up as the broken man she had left behind. But now here he was, standing tall with a woman by his side, someone who had no history with her, no ties to the betrayal, no reason to feel the weight of the past. It was a silent victory, one Jonathan didn't need to shout about, but one he felt in every fiber of his being. Laura stepped forward, offering a graceful nod to Tiffany. "Congratulations on your wedding," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I wish you both the best." Tiffany didn't respond immediately, her eyes flicking back and forth between Laura and Jonathan. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of their past hanging like a heavy curtain between them. Tiffany's lips pressed into a tight smile as she glanced at Albert, who stood beside her, awkwardly silent. "Thank you," she said, her words almost robotic. Jonathan knew it wasn't genuine. It never had been. Tiffany's words were always measured, calculated to make her seem like the victim, the one who had been forced into making difficult choices. But he could see through it now. He could see the cracks in the facade. Turning away from her, Jonathan nodded to Laura. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice low. She smiled softly at him, her hand slipping into his as they made their way to the table. The wedding was already beginning to feel less like a confrontation and more like an affirmation, a moment of release. Jonathan wasn't just letting go of the past. He was accepting the future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities. And as he sat down beside Laura, the music swirling in the background, he realized that this was where he was meant to be. Not in the past, not in the shadows of betrayal and loss, but here, in this moment, with a woman who had reminded him what it meant to feel whole again. The night unfolded before them, the clinking of glasses and the soft hum of conversation, fading into the background as Jonathan let go of the last remnants of his pain. He had made it through the hardest part. Now, he was free to rebuild, free to create a life that was his own, with Laura by his side and Joyce's laughter filling their home once more. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he was truly living again. Jonathan sat at his desk the following morning, his eyes fixed on the blueprints scattered across the surface. His architectural projects had always been his escape, a way to channel his energy, his frustrations, and his hopes into something tangible. But today, it felt different. The weight of the decisions he had made over the past few months hung over him, a reminder that for the first time in years, he was facing the life he had worked so hard to rebuild. It wasn't just about architecture anymore. It wasn't even about business. It was about something far more personal. The future and the people he was choosing to share it with. His mind kept drifting back to the wedding, to the way Laura had stood by him the entire time, her calm presence helping him face the ghosts of his past with a sense of strength he hadn't known he had. But the event had left him with more than just memories. It had forced him to confront the reality of how much things had changed. Tiffany, once the woman he had loved, had become a distant memory, a painful chapter in his life he now realized was closed for good. And yet seeing her at the wedding, standing beside Albert, her new partner, had left Jonathan with a strange mixture of emotions: resentment, disbelief, and surprisingly a bit of sadness. He had to admit to himself that a small part of him had hoped all these years that she would realize her mistakes, that she would come back. But as he watched her smile and laugh with Albert, Jonathan knew that was no longer possible. What was once love had been reduced to a transaction, an exchange of comfort, of convenience. Jonathan had spent so much of his life trying to make it work with Tiffany, trying to salvage a marriage that had been broken long before her betrayal. He had wanted to believe, for the sake of their daughter, that they could find their way back to one another. But now, standing in the aftermath of it all, Jonathan understood that sometimes love isn't enough. And sometimes the person you thought you could never live without becomes the one who holds you back the most. Turning his attention back to the papers on his desk, Jonathan's phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Laura. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to depend on her presence until he started seeing her in the small moments. The way she would ask about his day, how she would listen without judgment when he spoke about his past. In a world that had often felt cold and isolating, Laura had become his warmth. She had become a reminder that even in the face of loss and heartache, there was still a chance for new beginnings. He unlocked his phone and read the message. "Just checking in. Hope everything's going okay today. Don't forget to take a break, Jonathan. You're allowed to take a breath too." Her words, so simple yet so full of meaning, struck him deeply. It was something he needed to hear. He had spent so much of his life running, trying to outrun the ghosts of his past, trying to outwork the pain, that he had forgotten how to take a moment for himself. It was easy to get lost in the busyness of life, to focus solely on what needed to be done. But in doing so, he had neglected the very thing that mattered most: his peace of mind, his heart, and the people who truly cared for him. Jonathan stood up, pushing the blueprints aside, and walked over to the window. The view of the city outside was both beautiful and overwhelming. The city that had seen his rise from the ashes, the city that had given him the opportunities he needed to rebuild. His life was now the place where he would start something new, a life with purpose, a life with love. His phone buzzed again. It was a call this time, and he smiled when he saw the name: Laura. "Hey," Jonathan answered, his voice soft with the weight of everything that had been building inside him. "Hi, Jonathan. I just wanted to hear your voice," Laura said, her tone warm and steady. "I know you've got a lot on your mind, but I wanted to remind you that it's okay to let go of some of that burden. You've been through so much, and now it's time for you to focus on what really matters." Jonathan felt his chest tighten, as if her words were exactly what he needed to hear at that very moment. "I know. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. I don't know how I ever got so caught up in everything, but I'm ready to change, Laura. I'm ready to start really living again." Laura paused for a moment, and Jonathan could hear the smile in her voice. "You don't have to do it all at once, you know. Take it one step at a time. I'm right here, and so is Joyce. You're not alone in this." "I know," Jonathan said, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't think I've ever truly realized how much I needed someone like you until now. You've brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing. Well, Laura replied with a teasing tone, it's just my job to remind you that you're not just a businessman or an architect. You're also a person who deserves love, happiness, and peace. And those things don't have to come from the work you do or the success you've built. They can come from the relationships you've chosen to invest in. Jonathan couldn't help but smile. It was like Laura had a way of cutting through all the noise and reminding him of what really mattered, and for the first time in a long time. He felt like he was moving in the right direction, not just for his career, but for himself, for Joyce, and for the new family they were building. Thank you, Laura, Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll never be able to fully express how much you've done for me, but I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to make this work. For us. You already are, Laura replied, her words full of assurance. You don't have to prove anything. You're already doing the most important thing by being present, by letting yourself be open to love again. Jonathan stared out at the city, the weight of her words settling in his chest. It was strange how quickly life could change when you allowed yourself to open up. For so long, he had buried himself in work, in his duties as a father, in the expectations others had of him. But now, standing at the threshold of something new, he realized that he had been waiting for this moment all along. Laura, he said, his voice steady. There's something I want to ask you. Yes, Laura replied, sensing the shift in his tone. I don't know where this will lead, Jonathan began, his heart pounding in his chest, but I know one thing. I want to face the future with you. I want you to be part of my life, and Joyce's life. Will you be with us, for real this time? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jonathan's heart raced, and for a moment he feared he had said too much, too soon. But then Laura's voice broke through, filled with tenderness. Yes, Jonathan, I've already made that choice. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together. Jonathan felt a weight lift off his shoulders as if a door had finally opened, one he had kept closed for so long. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a future to look forward to, a future filled with love and the possibility of healing. And for the first time in years, Jonathan allowed himself to feel hope. Real hope, not the kind that relied on past achievements, but the kind that came from opening his heart and trusting in the people who had shown him nothing but kindness. As he hung up the phone, Jonathan stood in the stillness of his office, taking in a deep breath. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the road ahead would be different. It would be filled with challenges, of course, but it would also be filled with the kind of love and support he had longed for. And with Laura by his side, he knew he could face anything. He turned back to his desk, picking up his blueprints again. But this time his mind was clear. There was no longer any doubt about what he wanted from life. It wasn't just about success or fame. It was about love, trust, and building something lasting, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. He had everything he needed to start over, and he wasn't going to waste it. Let's do this, Jonathan whispered to himself, a smile tugging at his lips. And with that, he began to plan for the future, a future filled with love, family, and the promise of a new beginning. The air was thick with tension, every heartbeat pounding in Jonathan's chest as Tiffany took the microphone. The wedding reception, a lavish affair set in a grand ballroom overlooking the skyline of San Francisco, had been filled with laughter and joyous conversations. Guests in tuxedos and elegant gowns swirled around the dance floor, sipping champagne, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. Jonathan stood at the bar, his hand gripping a glass of water, when he saw Tiffany make her way toward the center of the room. She was teetering slightly, her movements stiff, clearly affected by the alcohol she had consumed. He knew Tiffany well enough to see the storm in her eyes. She was about to make a scene, a knot formed in his stomach. The memories of their painful divorce, her betrayal with Albert, and the emotional weight of it all rushed back. He had hoped the night would pass without incident, that he and Laura could attend the event, play their roles as Jonathan's girlfriend and fiancée, and make Tiffany realize that he had moved on. But something told him that hope was about to be shattered. Tiffany, her eyes narrowing with jealousy, grabbed the microphone, her voice shaky but loud enough for the entire room to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her tone sharp. I need to speak. There's something everyone here needs to know about Jonathan's new love. Jonathan's heart sank. He immediately glanced over at Laura standing beside him. He could see the faint tremor in her hands, a nervousness she hadn't shown before. Laura's eyes met his, but he couldn't read them. Was it fear, discomfort, or was it simply the sting of embarrassment, knowing that the woman who had hurt him so much was now attempting to tear her down? Tiffany continued, her words dripping with disdain. This woman, Laura, she's not the businesswoman she's pretending to be. She's not a high society woman, no. She was homeless, living on the streets before Jonathan decided to rescue her. And now she's working as his assistant. That's right, folks. She works for him. She's not who she claims to be. This is the woman who's stealing Jonathan away from his family. And I've got the proof. Thanks to Haley, Jonathan's former secretary, who kindly filled me in on everything. The room seemed to hold its breath, the guests whispering among themselves. Jonathan's stomach twisted. He felt his heart rate spike. The humiliation. He couldn't escape it. But then, as if on instinct, he felt Laura's hand slip into his, warm and steady. She was offering him comfort in the face of a storm that was out of his control. Laura's gaze never left Tiffany as she made her way to the microphone. Jonathan didn't know what she would say, how she would respond to Tiffany's venomous words. But he knew whatever came next, it would take strength, it would take courage, and it would have to be on her terms, not Tiffany's. The room fell completely silent as Laura stepped forward. Her confidence was clear in her stride, but Jonathan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Tiffany's accusations had landed hard, and though Jonathan could feel Laura's steadying presence, the weight of the words had made even her strong resolve waver. Laura stood in front of Tiffany, and for a moment it felt like the entire world was watching. She grasped the microphone with both hands, her fingers tightening around it. And then she spoke, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "Tiffany," Laura began, her voice echoing in the stillness, "yes, I've been homeless. I've lived through a lot of hardship, more than most people can understand. I've lived on the streets, but I've never once stolen anything from anyone. I've worked hard to rebuild my life, and I'm here today because of that strength. Jonathan did not rescue me. He gave me an opportunity, one I took with gratitude, and for that I will never apologize. You might think you know my story, but you don't." She paused, her eyes locked on Tiffany's, then turned to the room. "I'm not here to take anything away from anyone. What I have with Jonathan is not some charity case, Tiffany. It's a relationship built on mutual respect, trust, and a shared understanding of what it means to build a future together. You may look at me and see the past, but I see the future. And in that future, I am not just Jonathan's assistant. I am someone who has earned my place, not just in his life, but in this world." Her words rang out in the silent room, each syllable cutting through the tension. Jonathan felt his chest tighten with pride. Laura was not just defending herself. She was speaking truth into a world that had tried to erase her, to diminish her worth. Tiffany's face, once smug, faltered. The smile she had worn moments ago was gone, replaced by a mixture of confusion and envy. She hadn't expected this response. In her mind, she had assumed Laura would crumble, that she would apologize or cower in the face of her accusations. But Laura wasn't about to be diminished by anyone, let alone Tiffany. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he watched the two women stand in the middle of the room. Laura, who had once felt insignificant, now stood tall in her own power, owning the space around her. It was as if the weight of Tiffany's judgment had no effect on her anymore. She was no longer the woman from the streets. She was Laura, someone who had earned everything she had through sheer resilience and strength. Tiffany, still reeling from Laura's defiant stand, tried to recover. "Well, she began. But Jonathan cut her off, his voice firm. "That's enough, Tiffany," he said, his tone resolute. "You've made your point, but I think it's clear who the real winner is here. It's not about who's better, who has more, or who's more deserving. It's about honesty, love, and the kind of person you choose to be. And I've chosen Laura. I'm proud of that choice." The words hung in the air, settling like dust in the light of truth. Tiffany's anger turned to frustration as she realized she had lost. Not just Jonathan, but the power she had once held over him. It wasn't just the wedding that had made her realize it. It was the woman standing before her, unbroken, unbowed, and unwavering in her place beside Jonathan. As the tension in the room dissipated, Jonathan turned to Laura, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Let's go. We don't need to be a part of this any longer." Laura nodded, her eyes glistening with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She had said what needed to be said, and in that moment she knew she had taken her place in the world, not as a homeless woman seeking redemption, but as a woman who had fought for her happiness and was now reaping the rewards of that battle. As Jonathan and Laura left the ballroom, Their steps slow but sure, a weight lifted from both of them. They had faced down the ghosts of their past, and together they had emerged victorious. The world outside seemed brighter, less burdensome. They had weathered the storm, and though the future remained uncertain, they knew one thing for sure. Together, they could face anything. The wind had settled, and the sky above was clear. Jonathan stared out the window of his office, his gaze distant as he thought about everything that had transpired over the past few months. What had begun as a tumultuous journey, filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and endless nights of self-doubt, was slowly transforming into something new, something better. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of relief that filled him, he knew deep down that this was only the beginning of an even more complex chapter in his life. Laura had been the catalyst for the change. A woman who had walked into his life, as a stranger, a homeless person with a broken past. And yet somehow she had become his anchor, the person who had brought warmth and light back into his world. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this level of peace and fulfillment. He had always been so focused on building his career, on keeping up the facade of success, that he had failed to realize what he was truly missing. What he needed was not just a successful business or recognition from the world, but a family. A real one, grounded in love and mutual respect. He looked over to the corner of the room, where a small framed photograph sat on the desk. It was of Joyce, smiling wide with her arms around Laura. The picture captured a moment of pure happiness, something he had longed for but never truly achieved. Joyce was thriving. She was blossoming into a confident and joyful little girl, the light in her eyes a reflection of the love and care she received from both Jonathan and Laura. It was strange to think about how much had changed. Less than a year ago, Jonathan had been in a dark place fighting to keep his family together after Tiffany's betrayal. He had wanted to believe that everything would be fine, that Tiffany would come back to him, that their family could be healed. But now he realized how much he had been holding on to something that wasn't meant to be. Tiffany's absence, though painful, had opened up space for something better. A family based on understanding, on kindness, and on shared experiences. Not the kind of family he had grown up with, one built on conflict and resentment, but one that embraced each other's imperfections and flaws. Laura had been an unexpected part of that transformation. She had brought a different kind of strength into his life, one that didn't rely on wealth, power, or status, but on something more genuine. Empathy, resilience, and the willingness to fight for a better future. He had never imagined that a woman with such a turbulent past would be the one to pull him out of his despair, but in hindsight it made perfect sense. Laura had learned how to survive, and more importantly, how to rebuild. Her determination was infectious. As he sat back in his chair, Jonathan thought about the future. The sustainable architecture firm he had built from the ground up was thriving. His reputation had been restored after the betrayal with Albert, and his clients were now more invested in his vision than ever before. He had not only regained his standing in the business world, but had also become a true advocate for environmental sustainability, something that brought him a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. But his greatest success, the one that truly mattered, was his family. Joyce had found a role model in Laura, and Jonathan had found a partner who didn't just support him but challenged him to be a better man, a better father. Together they had created a home filled with laughter and love. It was a quiet, simple life, but it was exactly what they needed. The road had not been without its bumps. There were moments when Jonathan had second-guessed himself, especially in the early days of their relationship. He had been so used to the idea of perfection, of presenting a polished image to the world, that he struggled to let his guard down. He was afraid of being vulnerable, of exposing the wounds he had buried for so long. But Laura had shown him what it meant to be real, to be human, to admit that mistakes were a part of life and that healing didn't happen overnight. It wasn't easy for Laura either. She had come from a broken past, one filled with loss and hardship. Her journey to self-acceptance had been long and painful, and there were still days when the weight of her past threatened to pull her down. But in Jonathan's arms, she had found a safe place, a space where she didn't have to hide her scars. He had never once made her feel less than. Instead, he had shown her what it meant to be valued, to be loved without condition. And Joyce, sweet, bright-eyed Joyce, was the glue that held them all together. The little girl who had once been caught between two worlds now had a future, filled with endless possibilities. She had witnessed her father's heartbreak, but she had also seen his healing. She had watched as he became a better man, a better father, And in doing so, she had learned that love wasn't just about promises or words. It was about action, about showing up for the people who mattered the most. The more Jonathan reflected on the lessons they had all learned, the more he realized how fortunate they were. Life had not gone as planned. It hadn't turned out the way he had imagined in his younger years, but perhaps that was the beauty of it. Life had a way of surprising you, of leading you down paths you never thought possible. The key was to be open to those unexpected twists, to embrace the changes that came your way with an open heart. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the room, Jonathan heard the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. Joyce and Laura were making dinner together. Jonathan's favorite meal, of course. It had become a ritual in their home, these quiet evenings spent together, cooking, talking, and just being present. The family they had become was not perfect, but it was theirs, and that made it beautiful. He smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. There was still work to be done, still challenges to face, but for the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt ready. He had the love of his daughter, the support of Laura, and a future that was filled with endless possibilities. He stood up, walking toward the kitchen, his heart lighter than it had been in years. As he stepped into the room, Joyce looked up, her eyes twinkling as she stirred the pot. Laura glanced over, giving him a soft smile that spoke volumes. In that moment, Jonathan knew he had everything he needed. The past was behind him, the mistakes, the betrayal, the hurt. And now there was only the future, a future where love, family, and hope would continue to shape their lives, one step at a time. Jonathan walked up to Laura and Joyce, taking a deep breath. "I think I'm ready to face whatever comes next," he said softly, his voice filled with certainty. Laura looked at him, her expression tender. "We're ready too." And together they would move forward, stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. Jonathan's journey is one of profound transformation. From a successful architect, his life was filled with routines and responsibilities, but it was marked by deep emotional turmoil following the betrayal of his ex-wife, Tiffany, and his former business partner, Albert. His marriage dissolved under the weight of infidelity, and Jonathan found himself torn between his professional ambitions and his role as a father. With a deep commitment to his daughter Joyce, Jonathan focused on rebuilding his life, but little did he know that his path would lead him to a surprising new chapter. When Jonathan found himself at his ex-wife's wedding, faced with humiliation and the looming presence of Albert, he asked Laura, a homeless woman he had recently met, to pretend to be his date. Laura's appearance was initially met with judgment and gossip, but as the evening unfolded, she showed a strength and grace that deeply impacted Jonathan. Their story soon became one of healing, mutual support, and love, as Jonathan realized that true happiness doesn't lie in wealth or status, but in building genuine relationships rooted in trust, kindness, and resilience. As Jonathan and Laura grew closer, Jonathan's life began to shift dramatically. Through his work with Laura and their shared efforts to care for Joyce, Jonathan learned the importance of vulnerability and emotional connection. He began to see that success and wealth were hollow without the warmth of love and companionship. Jonathan's journey toward healing and ultimately finding peace with his past was one of embracing change, understanding that family is not about perfection but about unconditional love and support. The lesson from Jonathan's journey is clear. Success and wealth can never replace love, family, and emotional fulfillment. In life, we may face betrayal, loss, or moments when we question our worth, but it's essential to remember that these experiences shape who we become. They push us to evolve, to heal, and to create a better future for ourselves and those we love. It's never too late to rebuild, to change our lives, and to embrace new opportunities. Whether it's forgiving ourselves, letting go of toxic relationships, or being open to new people, we must always be open to transformation. Life lesson. The key takeaway is that material success is not the ultimate goal. Love, compassion, and resilience in the face of adversity matter more. Life is about building meaningful relationships, learning to grow from challenges, and nurturing the bonds that truly matter. How can this lesson be applied in today's world? In today's fast-paced world, we often find ourselves chasing success, wealth, and status. However, Jonathan's story reminds us to take a step back and reevaluate what truly brings happiness. Whether in our personal or professional lives, we should prioritize the people who matter most, nurture those relationships, and be open to change and growth. Life's challenges offer opportunities for growth, and with resilience and a positive outlook, we can rebuild, starting with our own hearts. Interactive question. What is the most important takeaway from Jonathan's journey? A. Success and wealth are the most important goals in life. B. True happiness comes from love, family, and personal growth. Comment your answer below with either A or B to let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear your opinions, so feel free to share your views on Jonathan's story and how it resonates with you. Final call to action. If you enjoyed this story and the lessons shared, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep creating content that inspires and uplifts. Stay tuned for more exciting and touching stories to come.